Darius Whitmore entered his wife's glittering gala, wearing the same modest suit she had mocked for years. Before 800 guests, Simone raised a champagne glass, called him a financial failure, and announced she was leaving him for the wealthy CEO Grant Holloway. Laughter rolled across the ballroom as security moved to remove Darius, but before anyone touched him, 30 executives rose from the front tables. One by one, they lowered their heads. "Good evening, Chairman Whitmore." Simone's smile vanished. Grant dropped his glass. Because the man they had humiliated controlled the billions funding their entire empire, and tonight he had brought the evidence to destroy it. Stay until the final vote because Simone's cruelest betrayal will trigger a punishment no guest inside that ballroom expects tonight. Darius woke alone in the wide, silent house in Buckhead, the far side of the bed, cold as it had been for months. Simone had claimed again that she needed to stay late, finishing preparations for the biggest gala in the history of Halcyon Crown developments. On the kitchen counter, he found the invitation to that gala sitting inside an envelope with no name written on it, and beside it, a short note in Simone's handwriting that read, "Simply do not embarrass me tonight." For half a year, she had mocked the plainness of his clothes, the age of his sedan, and the vague, unremarkable consulting work he claimed to do, never suspecting that the quiet image was deliberate, built to keep reporters and power-hungry strangers far from his door. Years earlier, before Simone's career had taken off, Darius had used his own discreet connections to secure her very first interview at Halcyon Crown, a fact he had never once mentioned because he wanted her to believe every success afterward belonged entirely to her. He remembered the early years without any bitterness, only a quiet ache. There had been a season when Simone worked 2 jobs while finishing her degree, and Darius sat beside her at a scratched kitchen table until 3 in the morning, quizzing her on marketing theory and telling her she would run a company one day. Back then, she had laughed at the idea, calling it impossible, and Darius had told her that impossible things simply took longer to build. He never imagined that the very confidence he poured into her would one day be turned against him, used as proof that he had never been ambitious enough to deserve a seat at her table. Something had shifted once Simone began working closely with Grant Holloway. She came home wearing jewelry that cost more than their first house, disappeared on trips that never appeared on any company calendar, and returned with a stranger's cologne clinging faintly to her coat. Darius had known about the affair for 3 months and had chosen not to confront her immediately because a darker discovery had taken priority. Preston Maddox, the chief financial officer at Halcyon Crown, had quietly delivered him a file showing that Grant had diverted at least $84 million out of active development accounts, some of the transfers authorized under Simone's own administrative credentials. Darius did not yet know whether his wife was a willing accomplice or simply a tool Grant had used without her full understanding, and that uncertainty was the only reason he had not yet acted. He decided to attend the gala not to save the marriage at any cost, but to give Simone one final chance to tell him the truth before the people who answered to him took matters out of his hands. Before leaving the house, he opened a wooden box and took out an old watch Simone had given him during their first year of marriage, back when she had told him that as long as they had each other, they owed the world no explanations. He fastened it to his wrist as a quiet reminder of the woman he had once loved, then checked his phone as he reached for his keys. A message from Camille Sutton, the general counsel of his firm, informed him that Grant had just added a personal announcement to the evening's program, one that would put Simone on stage beside him. Darius typed back a single instruction telling her not to interfere because he wanted to hear exactly what his wife intended to say. Camille replied with a single line of caution, warning him that whatever Simone said tonight could not be unsaid once it left her mouth. And Darius answered that he understood exactly what he was walking into. The drive into the city felt longer than usual. Darius passed the modest office building, where Whitmore Meridian kept a small, unmarked suite used only for private meetings, and he thought briefly about the years he had spent building an empire that almost no one could name. He had never wanted fame. He had wanted a wife who loved him without needing proof of his worth printed on a business card, and somewhere along the way, that version of Simone had quietly disappeared, replaced by a woman chasing a version of success measured entirely in appearances. He thought too of the day he had first met Simone at a community college career fair, where she had worn a borrowed blazer 2 sizes too large and asked him sharp, unflinching questions about market cycles that most people twice her age could not answer. He had fallen for her ambition long before he fell for anything else. And for years that ambition had felt like a gift they shared. Somewhere in the last 3 years, it had curdled into something else. Something that needed an audience to feel real. Darius did not know exactly when the shift had happened, only that by the time he noticed it, it had already hardened into contempt. Malcolm Reddick met him briefly in the hotel parking garage, stepping out from behind a pillar with the quiet discretion of a man who had spent decades in rooms where discretion mattered more than charisma. He asked Darius one final time whether he was certain he wanted to walk in alone, without security, without warning. Darius told him that Simone deserved the chance to hang herself with her own words before anyone intervened, because a man who stepped in too early would never truly know what his wife believed when she thought no one with power was watching. Malcolm nodded, once told him the room was ready the moment he needed it, and disappeared back inside ahead of him. The gala unfolded inside the Beaumont Grand, where 800 investors, local politicians, journalists, and society figures gathered beneath a soaring screen, displaying the Halcyon Crown emblem and the evening's theme building, Tomorrow. Grant arrived in a tailored tuxedo, trailed constantly by cameras and admirers, while Simone stood beside him in a silver gown that had cost tens of thousands of dollars. When Darius walked in, she did not cross the room to greet him. She glanced once at his plain suit and turned away, as though she did not recognize the man she had married 12 years earlier. At the reception table, staff could not find his name among the seats reserved for leadership because Simone had quietly moved him to a smaller table near the service entrance tucked behind a column where the catering staff passed back and forth all evening. Grant approached with practiced warmth and told Darius he admired his courage for showing up among so much success. He asked almost mockingly how much money Darius currently managed for his clients. Darius answered evenly that he managed enough to know exactly whose money to keep a company alive. A remark Grant dismissed as empty bravado from a man he assumed had nothing behind him. Grant clapped him lightly on the shoulder, the gesture of a man used to being humored, and moved on toward a cluster of reporters without waiting for a reply. Simone pulled her husband aside and demanded he leave before the speeches began, insisting that the night mattered too much for her future and that he did not belong there. Darius asked her plainly whether she wanted him gone because of his suit or because of the man whose hand kept resting on her back. Simone did not deny the affair. Instead, she told him he was no longer worthy of standing beside her, that Grant possessed vision power and the ability to give her a life Darius could never provide. When he asked whether Grant had told her the $2.4 billion acquisition still lacked final approval, she laughed and accused her husband of jealousy, telling him bitterness did not suit him and that he should learn to lose gracefully. Across the ballroom, Malcolm Reddick and 29 other senior executives had already recognized Darius, but at his earlier request, every one of them stayed silent, watching the evening unfold without revealing what they knew. Some exchanged quiet glances, uncertain how long they could keep composure, while a room full of strangers mocked the man they answered to. Behind the stage, Lenora Hayes waited with a team of attorneys and financial documents, prepared to move the instant Darius gave the signal, checking her watch every few minutes, as though counting down towards something inevitable. When the host announced that Grant had a second, more personal announcement that would change the future of two very special people, Grant extended his hand toward Simone and led her toward the stage. She glanced back at her husband one last time, her smile cold and certain, as though she believed she was walking toward a life that finally matched her ambitions. Grant opened his remarks by boasting that Halcyon Crown was about to enter an era of unprecedented growth with the acquisition of Arden Peak properties nearly finalized. He then turned to praise Simone as the woman who had stood beside a vision far greater than her own life, inviting her to speak. Simone looked down into the crowd, found Darius seated alone near the service entrance, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then chose ambition over loyalty. She told the room that for years she had carried a marriage to a man without ambition, describing Darius as someone who lived off his wife's success, held no stable career, and could never keep pace with the world she now belonged. 2. Laughter rippled through parts of the ballroom, while others shifted uncomfortably, saying nothing. She continued, claiming that Darius called himself a financial consultant, though no one in the room had ever heard his name. She invited him to stand, so the crowd could see in her words the man who always promised greatness and never delivered it. Grant lifted his glass and called Darius living proof that a woman should never let pity stand in the way of her future. Simone announced she had already prepared divorce papers and intended to begin a new life with Grant once the acquisition closed, adding that Darius should be grateful she had endured him for as long as she had. A few guests applauded, politely unsure what else to do, while others glanced toward Darius with quiet discomfort, sensing something was wrong with the entire spectacle, even if they could not name it. Darius did not raise his voice. He simply unfastened the old watch from his wrist and set it on the table in front of him, then asked Simone if she was certain this was how she wanted 12 years of marriage to end. She answered that the marriage had ended the day she realized he was nobody at all. Grant signaled security to escort Darius from the building. 2 guards approached, and Darius rose without resistance. But the instant one hand reached for his arm, Malcolm Reddick stood from his seat, straightened his jacket, lowered his head, and said, "Good evening, Chairman Whitmore." A female executive at a nearby table rose next. Then a third rose, then a fourth. Within seconds, all 30 executives were on their feet, facing Darius, speaking together in a single word, "Chairman." The ballroom fell completely silent, the kind of silence that seemed to press against the walls. Simone still believed it was some kind of joke, and kept smiling, while Grant's face drained of color, as he recognized several of the standing figures as leaders of the very banks and funds financing Halcyon Crown. Darius looked at his wife, and told her she was right, that very few people had ever heard his name, and that was precisely because the people who needed to know already did. Behind them, the massive screen suddenly changed. The Halcyon Crown logo disappeared, replaced by the emblem of Whitmore Meridian Group and the words "Emergency Shareholder Review," authorized by Chairman Darius Whitmore. A murmur spread through the crowd like wind through dry grass, guests turning to one another, whispering questions no one could yet answer. Lenora Hayes walked out from the wings with Camille Sutton and a team of forensic accountants, and in front of everyone, she confirmed that Darius was the founder, controlling shareholder, and chairman of Whitmore Meridian Group. She explained that the firm held 41% of the indirect voting power inside Halcyon Crown, controlled a $900 million revolving credit line, held $1,100 million in convertible bonds, retained final approval authority over the Arden Peak deal, and possessed the right to demand an emergency vote the moment financial fraud was discovered. Darius, she told them, had stepped away from public leadership years earlier, after building a discreet governance model, but he had never surrendered his position as chairman. Grant lunged for the microphone and accused the entire scene of being an act of revenge from a humiliated husband. Darius replied that he had not frozen the deal because of an affair, but because $84 million had vanished from project accounts, meant to build homes and jobs, and the screen behind him now displayed the transfers flowing into 4 shell companies, each one registered under a name that meant nothing to anyone in the room except the handful of people who had built them. Grant immediately blamed Preston Maddox, but Preston stepped forward and told the room that Grant had forced him to sign falsified reports under threat of losing everything he had worked for, and that Simone had been given direct access to one of the suspicious accounts under review. Darius asked his wife why she had received a $3,600,000 consulting bonus from a company with no employees, no offices, and no purpose beyond moving money quietly, and Simone had no answer, her mouth opening and closing without a single word emerging. Grant shifted tactics, warning that if Halcyon Crown collapsed, Whitmore Meridian would lose billions alongside it, hoping to frighten the room into siding with him. Darius answered quietly that money could always be earned again, while trust and honor once destroyed could not be rebuilt with a single wire transfer. Rather than surrender, Grant smiled and revealed what he believed was his final defense, holding up a document bearing what appeared to be Darius's own signature. claiming his rival no longer possessed the legal authority to act as chairman, because he had permanently transferred that power years earlier. Seeing an opening, Simone declared that he had no power left in that room at all, her voice suddenly steady again, as though she had found solid ground beneath her feet. The document Grant projected showed a voting transfer agreement signed 8 months earlier, surrendering Darius's controlling shares to a new trust with Simone Whitmore listed as the designated representative and beneficiary. Simone first claimed she knew nothing about the details, then quickly reversed herself, insisting Darius had once promised to leave everything to her if anything ever happened to him. Camille examined the paper and confirmed the signature appeared authentic and the notarization appeared legitimate at first glance. Grant ordered security to remove Darius from the building for interfering in a corporate event, and for a moment doubt spread through parts of the crowd, whispers turning from confusion to suspicion. Simone descended from the stage and leaned close to her husband, whispering that he had been foolish enough to sign something without reading it carefully, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. The truth surfaced slowly through memory. 8 months earlier, Simone had handed Darius a stack of papers she described as marriage insurance documents, urging him to sign quickly before a business trip, telling him it was simply routine paperwork their attorney had recommended. Suspicious. Even then, Darius had signed using a deliberately altered version of his signature, a small reversed hook he used only when he sensed a document carried risk of fraud, a habit built from years of protecting himself against exactly this kind of maneuver. The transfer agreement, moreover, required ratification from 2 independent board members before taking effect, and Grant had forged both signatures using letterhead stolen from an old filing cabinet at the firm. When Camille pulled up the file's metadata at Darius's request, it revealed the electronic document had been created on Grant's personal computer 2 days after Darius had signed the original stack. Simone gave him proving the pages had been swapped afterward while he was traveling. Simone turned on Grant, reminding him he had assured her the arrangement was completely legal and that nothing could ever trace back to either of them. Grant answered coldly that she had helped him willingly, and moments later, a string of their private messages appeared on the screen, including one where Simone had written that once control belonged to her, Darius would have nothing left to fight with, and another where she asked Grant when they could finally stop pretending. For Darius, the wound went far beyond infidelity. His wife had not merely fallen in love with another man. She had actively conspired to seize control of everything he had built and use his own position to construct a future with someone else. His pain showed not in shouting but in complete stillness, the kind of stillness that made the surrounding room feel colder. He asked her whether she had ever intended to tell him before taking it all away, and Simone answered that she believed he had never deserved the power he kept hidden, that a man who hid his own worth had no right to complain when someone else claimed it instead. Camille announced that the forged signatures rendered the entire agreement void, but Grant only laughed, telling the room he no longer needed that document at all, because he had already sold a portion of Whitmore Meridian's confidential financial data to a foreign competitor and was holding evidence that could trigger a federal investigation into Darius himself. A ripple of alarm passed through the standing executives, some glancing toward Lenora for reassurance she did not yet have to give. Grant claimed he possessed files proving that Whitmore Meridian used intermediary companies to disguise illegal international transactions, accusing Darius of turning Halcyon Crown into a laundering operation. Reporters in the room began streaming the moment live phones raised and shares connected to both companies threatened to plummet the instant markets opened the following morning. Grant laid out his terms in front of everyone, his voice steady with the confidence of a man who believed he still controlled the room. Darius would confirm the Arden Peak acquisition. Whitmore Meridian would release an additional $600 million. Darius would resign as chairman, and every internal investigation would end immediately in exchange for Grant's silence and the data never reaching federal authorities. Darius recognized the maneuver for what it was, an attempt to dress extortion up as a business negotiation in front of witnesses who could later be told it had all been a misunderstanding. Simone begged Grant to stop, only to be pushed aside, as he told her plainly that she had only ever been useful for obtaining her husband's signature, and in that instant she finally understood he had never planned to share power with. her at all. Grant added that he had already prepared a press release, ready to place full blame for the embezzlement on Simone alone, should his plan fail. And something in her expression broke the confidence she had worn all evening, finally cracking open. Somewhere in the crowd, a young analyst from one of the lending banks whispered to a colleague that she had never seen a hostile takeover attempt unravel in real time, in front of a live audience with no lawyers whispering in a private room, to soften the blow. Others simply stood frozen phones, lowered now, sensing that whatever was unfolding mattered too much to be reduced to a video clip. The energy in the ballroom had shifted entirely from celebration to something closer to a courtroom, and every person present understood without needing to be told that they were witnessing the end of something and the beginning of something else. Darius faced a choice between yielding to protect the company's reputation or allowing Grant to release data that had already been quietly altered. Lenora urged him never to negotiate with an extortionist, reminding him softly that giving in tonight would only invite the next demand tomorrow. Darius, who had anticipated exactly this move, calmly asked Grant whether he was certain the files he held were the only copies. Grant boasted that he had copied the entire server, confident in his own preparation. Preston stepped forward and confirmed that the security team had detected the unauthorized copying months earlier, and instead of blocking, it had quietly replaced the sensitive files with decoy data containing traceable markers embedded in every fabricated transaction. Anyone who opened or transferred those files would leave a permanent digital trail behind them, one that could not be erased or explained away. Camille revealed that Grant had already forwarded the decoy files to 3 offshore accounts, an act that proved nothing against Darius, but proved conclusively that Grant had stolen trade secrets and attempted to sell confidential financial data to outside parties. As Grant tried to slip away from the stage, the ballroom doors were sealed under evidence protection protocol, a measure Camille had quietly triggered the moment the first threat was made. In that moment, Simone seized the microphone and announced she could prove Grant was the true mastermind behind everything, claiming she was holding a secret recording. But before offering it, she demanded that Darius protect her from all legal consequences. In return, her voice trembling, now the polish of the evening finally giving way to something closer to panic. She explained that Grant had once boasted about the entire scheme inside a private apartment, and because she never fully trusted him, she had recorded the conversation on her phone without his knowledge. The recording, she said, could prove that Grant had created the shell companies, ordered the forged documents, used her to reach her husband's signature plan to place all blame on her, and intended to drain funds from the company. Immediately after the Arden Peak deal closed, when Darius asked why she had not come forward sooner, she admitted she had kept it as insurance, in case Grant ever betrayed her, never intending to use it to protect anyone but herself. Simone pulled her husband to a quieter corner and tried to summon their shared past, recalling the small apartment where they had once lived. The nights Darius stayed up, helping her finish her business degree, the promises they had whispered to each other before either of them had anything to their name. She confessed that power had blinded her, that somewhere along the way she had started measuring her worth by what other people thought of her instead of what she actually had. Darius asked her directly whether she would have felt any regret if the 30 executives had never stood up that night, if Grant's plan had simply succeeded quietly, without witnesses, without exposure. Her silence was the only answer he needed. He refused to guarantee she would face no prosecution, though he promised her cooperation would be considered, and that she would be treated fairly by the process, not shielded from it. Furious, Simone insisted that after 12 years of marriage, he owed her one act of rescue, that loyalty should count for something even now. Darius answered quietly that he had once been her husband, but he had never been her shield against consequences, and that the two things had never been the same. In the end, with no other option left, she handed her phone containing the recording over to Camille. On the recording, Grant's own voice revealed that he intended to marry Simone only long enough to legally access shared assets before ensuring she alone bore the full criminal responsibility, describing her coldly as a convenient signature and nothing more. In the same recording, Simone was heard saying She did not care what happened to Darius, so long as she became the wife of a wealthy, standing in front of the very people who had just heard it. The entire ballroom heard those words, and Darius turned away, unable to look at his wife, the last fragile thread of hope he had carried into that room, finally severed. When Camille examined the phone further, she discovered the recording was not the only evidence stored inside it. Buried in the memory was an unsent email draft written by Simone, outlining a plan to falsely claim Darius suffered from mental illness in order to strip him of control over his own assets through the courts. She had never sent it, but its existence proved the conspiracy had been forming for months before that night ever began, long before Grant had ever mentioned a gala or an acquisition. Darius called for the gala to be suspended entirely and converted into an emergency shareholder meeting. Camille confirmed that enough board members and proxy holders were present to conduct a lawful vote. And when Grant objected, Malcolm Reddick read aloud the clause, permitting the chairman to convene an immediate meeting upon discovering systemic fraud, his voice carrying easily across the publique, now silent room. 4 resolutions were placed before the room suspend Grant Holloway as chief executive, freeze every account tied to the shell companies, cancel the Arden Peak acquisition to prevent further losses, and establish a protection fund for innocent employees and contractors who had nothing to do with what had happened. When Grant argued that removing him would bankrupt the company, Darius unveiled a restructuring plan, already prepared in advance, in which Whitmore Meridian would supply a controlled emergency credit line. Lenora would temporarily oversee daily operations. Preston would serve as interim chief financial officer supported by an outside audit team. No lower-level employee would lose their job over leadership's actions, and any personal assets traced to embezzled funds would be seized to repay the damage. The plan, methodical and calm, stood in sharp contrast to the chaos Grant had just tried to manufacture. The vote took place in front of every remaining guest. 92% supported suspending Grant. 89% supported a special investigation. 94% supported canceling the acquisition. 100% supported the Employee Protection Fund. Grant's executive access was severed on the spot, his corporate cards frozen, his accounts locked, and the company's private aircraft grounded before he could board it. When Simone asked what would become of her position, Darius declined to decide her fate personally, wanting to avoid any accusation of personal revenge, and instead asked the independent board to review her role without his involvement. The board voted to suspend her immediately for helping Grant obtain the fraudulent signature, accepting money from an unexplained source, failing to disclose a clear conflict of interest, misusing a company event for personal gain, participating in a plan to undermine the chairman himself. Grant lunged toward Darius, accusing him of destroying everything out of jealousy, spit flying from his mouth as security finally moved to restrain him. Darius answered that Grant had not lost his company because of him, but because he had believed everyone in that room had a price and had simply been wrong about who was for sale. Moments after the vote concluded, financial investigators and federal agents entered the ballroom, their presence silencing whatever murmurs remained. Their leader announced a warrant to seize Grant Holloway's devices and records, then turned to Simone and told her they needed her to accompany them as well to answer several questions. In the weeks that followed, the Gala Halcyon Crown entered a full restructuring process, its offices quiet in a way they had never been before. The audit revealed total damages of $117 million, far higher than the initial estimate, uncovering layers of fraud that had gone unnoticed for years. Grant was charged with securities fraud, embezzlement document, forgery, theft of trade secrets, extortion, and unauthorized transfer of data overseas, and much of his property, including his apartment luxury vehicles, investment accounts, and shell company holdings, was frozen pending trial. Simone cooperated with investigators, surrendering every message exchange between her and Grant, and her cooperation spared her from the most severe charges, though she still faced accountability for financial fraud and conspiracy to seize voting control from her own husband. She was ordered to repay the $3,600,000 she had received, and her reputation inside the business world collapsed almost overnight as people who had once flattered her at every event stopped returning her calls entirely. Darius filed for divorce, citing infidelity, financial fraud, and a breach of marital trust, though he did not attempt to take everything from Simone. He asked only to protect the assets that had existed before their marriage, along with the assets she had tried to seize through deception. During mediation held in a small, unremarkable conference room, far from any ballroom, Simone asked why he had never told her he was chairman of something so powerful. Darius explained that she had always known he ran an investment fund, but she had never shown genuine interest in his work until she believed he no longer benefited her image, that her curiosity had only ever followed her ambition, rather than led it. He had once planned to reveal everything, once they were ready to build a shared charitable foundation together, a project they had discussed quietly in their earliest years. But the more successful he became privately, the more she looked down on the ordinary man she thought she had married. Simone said things might have been different had she known the truth from the beginning, and Darius answered that her words only confirmed why nothing could have gone differently, since she had only learned to respect power after seeing it displayed in front of witnesses. Before mediation concluded, Darius returned the old watch that had once symbolized their love, not as punishment, but to close a chapter he had held on to for far too long, setting it gently on the table between them, without another word. Simone, in a final act, revealed that Grant still maintained a hidden account holding tens of millions of dollars that investigators had not yet located, handing Darius a string of numbers and telling him this was the last thing she could do. Right? That information helped authorities uncover a secret network of accounts worth $49 million, most of which was returned to Halcyon Crown, its contractors, and its employee payroll fund, restoring paychecks that had been delayed for months. Grant eventually accepted a plea agreement after his own associates turned to testify against him, losing control of the company, and most of the wealth he had built through fraud, his name quietly disappearing from every masthead boardroom he had once dominated. Simone received a lighter sentence than Grant because of her cooperation, though she was still required to make financial restitution and was barred from holding an executive position at any public company for several years. A professional exile that stung far more than any courtroom could express. In the months that followed, she took a modest job at a small marketing firm 2 states away, using an unremarkable version of her maiden name, trying to rebuild something quieter than the life she had once chased under bright chandeliers. Old acquaintances occasionally recognized her, whispering behind her back at grocery stores and community events, and she learned slowly and painfully what it felt like to be looked at the way she had once looked at her husband. Grant, for his part, spent his first year in a minimum security facility, drafting letters to former colleagues that none of them answered, insisting even then that he had simply been playing a game everyone else was too weak to win. He lost his license to operate as a corporate officer permanently, and by the time his sentence concluded, the industry that had once celebrated him had moved on so completely that few people under 30 even recognized his name. Where Darius had built quietly and let his name mean something only to the people who mattered, Grant had built loudly and discovered too late that noise without substance eventually goes silent on its own. Darius did not attend the sentencing to witness their downfall. Instead, he remained at Whitmore Meridian, unveiling a new governance model designed to limit any single leader from ever holding unchecked power again, believing that no company, including his own, should ever depend entirely on one person's silence or one person's signature. During the transition, Camille led a series of closed-door hearings meant to determine exactly how deep Grant's fraud had reached, and it was there that a mid-level project manager named Bianca Foster came forward admitting she had been quietly instructed to falsify site inspection reports for 2 years under threat of losing her job. Rather than punish her, Darius offered her immunity in exchange for full cooperation, telling the board afterward that a company which punished honesty alongside guilt would never earn honesty again. Bianca's testimony helped investigators trace another $11 million that had been hidden inside inflated construction invoices, money that was eventually returned to the very neighborhoods it had been stolen from. Halcyon Crown was later renamed after its restructuring, and a portion of its future profits was redirected into a fund protecting workers and small businesses harmed by the fraud that had nearly destroyed them. Preston kept his position. Once the investigation confirmed, he had tried to stop the wrongdoing from the beginning. His quiet courage finally recognized instead of punished. Lenora continued overseeing daily operations, steady as always, and Darius, for the first time in years, chose to appear publicly, more often accepting direct accountability before shareholders rather than remaining hidden behind boardroom doors, deciding that anonymity had cost him more than it had ever protected him from. 6 months later, Darius returned to the very same Beaumont Grand Ballroom. This time there was no red carpet, no champagne, no boastful speeches, only department heads and employee representatives gathered. For the company's annual meeting, the room lit plainly, rather than dressed for spectacle. He wore the same plain suit Simone had once mocked in front of 800 strangers. When he walked in, the same 30 executives who had once risen to call him chairman began to rise again. But Darius raised his hand and asked them to remain seated, telling them that no one needed to stand for a title, only for doing what was right, especially when doing right came at a cost. The room settled quietly, yet the respect inside it ran far deeper than any applause from that glittering night months before. After the divorce was finalized, Simone sent Darius a letter of apology, not asking to return, but admitting she had fallen in love with the image of power rather than the man who had quietly loved her long before that power ever existed. Darius read it once and placed it in a drawer, choosing not to respond, understanding that forgiveness did not require reopening a door that betrayal had already destroyed. He had learned slowly and painfully that peace did not always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it simply looked like walking forward without carrying the weight of what someone else had broken. At the company meeting, he stepped up to speak, and the screen behind him displayed no net worth, no image of himself, only a list of the employees, contractors, and investors who had finally been repaid in full names, scrolling quietly across the room where a logo had once promised a future built on lies. He looked out over the rows where 30 leaders had once stood and called him chairman, and understood that the moment that had truly mattered was never the instant the room learned who he was, but everything he chose to do afterward, with the power he had spent so long protecting. Years later, when younger analysts joined Whitmore Meridian and asked Lenora how the firm had weathered one of the largest corporate scandals in the region's history, without losing a single major investor, she would tell them the story, carefully, without embellishment, describing a chairman who chose evidence over emotion and restitution over revenge. She never mentioned Simone's name, unless asked directly, and when she did, she spoke of her not with cruelty, but with a kind of tired honesty, calling her a reminder that ambition without conscience always finds its own ceiling eventually. New employees who heard the story often asked the same question, wanting to know whether Darius had ever truly forgiven his wife, and Lenora always gave the same answer, telling them that forgiveness and forgetting were two entirely different acts, and that Darius had mastered only the first. Darius himself rarely spoke of that night at all. He kept the framed seating chart from the gala in a drawer in his office, not as a trophy, but as a private reminder of how quickly a room could turn, and how important it was to know exactly who stood on solid ground when it did. He built in the years that followed a foundation, in Simone's maiden name for scholarships, supporting first-generation business students, a gesture that confused people who expected bitterness, but one that made perfect sense to anyone who understood him. He was not honoring the woman who had betrayed him. He was honoring the version of her he had once believed in, back when ambition still meant building something together rather than tearing something apart. Simone had once humiliated Darius because she believed a man who never displayed his power could never truly hold any. But on the night 30 executives rose together in that ballroom, she discovered far more than her husband's hidden title. She discovered that the man she had thrown away had quietly kept her entire world standing upright, and that it took only a single vote to take it out of the hands of the people who had betrayed him.